Hi there. Today, let's look at West African textiles. Textiles play a very important role in the design and makeup of a lot of cultural ideas. In earlier lectures where we talked about how certain kinds of objects might be a repository for cultural knowledge, textiles play a very important role in sort of maintaining cultural ideas, identities, defining someone's relationship to each other through the use of clothing, design, and textiles are a way of kind of signifying, but also sort of embodying those values and ideas. To begin with, let's just look at a variety of different kinds of textiles from different parts of Africa. Here in West Africa, this is Central Africa, Zaire, or the Central African Congo. Here, the Ituri, who are people who live deep in the jungle, who have and live and maintain a very basic subsistence kind of hunter-gatherer existence in the jungle. They make a fabric there called the bark cloth, which is basically strips of bark that have been pulled off the tree and softly pounded into so the fibers mesh, sort of making what might be called a felt. And that way they're sort of building up and creating these fabrics. These are then painted with natural vegetable dyes to create a variety of patterns. The designs of these are rather mysterious in the way that they indicate a broad variety of different ideas. They in part suggest the idea of pathways through the jungle, the journeys that people make from one known site to another around their region. In a sense, it's not a literal map, but a kind of suggestion of the ways in which they move through the world. It also, the kind of linking and shifting, changing nature of the patterns suggests the ideas of music, the way that they sing. They have very distinctive ways of singing and interlocking their voices. And these shifting and changing patterns have been used to describe the way people sing together. So this is a very interesting way in which the Ituri, who have this ways of sort of expressing their values, their concepts about the way the world is, the world around them is linking and diverging. You notice this sort of series of sort of basic patterns that sort of slowly morph from one to another. There's a kind of unity across the whole piece, but there's also some very interesting shifting and divergent areas. Here are some other examples of Ituri bark cloth. And again, you can see the way it sort of establishes a pattern and then begins to sort of shift and change, introducing new elements and expanding and elaborating on those elements. So you have this piece which is, again, kind of unified by a couple of basic design choices, but also displays an extraordinary variety of design options in a very creative way. Another kind of fabric, which is quite common in West Africa, is wax resist. Here, wax is a kind of beeswax, is sort of painted onto white woven cotton fabric, and then dyed in indigo, and then overpainted. So to create these two different colors, initially a design is painted on, and then another part of the design is dyed, and then another part of the design is painted on, and then it is finally washed off. If you look closely at wax resist, there tends to be a kind of crackle powder. And so this is Yoruba. This is a popular cloth that would be worn by people as a way of kind of designing and decorating sort of everyday fabrics. Here's another example of the Adiri Echo. So it's painted with cassava starch as a resist, and the areas of cassava remain white, and the uncovered areas are dark blue, which is the indigo dye. In the 1920s and 30s, the dealer was a major local craft in the towns of Abeokuta and Ibadan, attracting buyers from all over West Africa. But by the end of the decade, problems over quality caused the spread of synthetic indigo and caustic soda, coupled with the influx of new, less skilled entrants into the craft, led to a collapse in demand, which it never recovered. More complex and beautiful starch-resist designs continued to be produced until the early 1970s. It's had some revival from the U.S. Peace Corps in the 1960s, but never gained popularity. One of the things that has sort of supplanted traditional hand-painted resist dye is the sort of artificial resist dye, wax resist dye, called Ankara. And this is really when you see a lot of popularity across all of the continent of Africa now. You'll find people wearing these incredibly bright, vivid patterns. This was originally designed by J.B. Prevenair, a Dutch merchant who had designs to import large quantities of cheaply manufactured, brightly patterned batik to sell to Javanese at a very cheap cost. The Javanese, who have very sophisticated batik tastes, were not interested in this, but for Africans who had grown up on the cassava resist dyeing, this became a much more vivid, exciting alternative. So it became widely popular and in Ghana and elsewhere in Africa, and you can still see it in fashions today. So this is a European introduced textile product that is now produced in Africa and is still very widely popular. As you've probably seen, people dress up in these extremely bright and dynamic, bold, geometric patterns and sort of partially organic, and they usually have a kind of crackle pattern inside them. That's usually a signature quality of the wax resist style. We've also sort of briefly mentioned the Royal Kuba Raffia cloth. Raffia is a very laborious process of woven of pieces of cut pile and then sort of embroidered together to create these extremely intricate and designed for this. The diagonal interlocking patterns is known as the creeper vine, the ma'am pattern. We talked about that before. There are hundreds of different designs that have very specific references to known royal personages and also different values and ideas among the Kuba. The cut pile, of course, has an incredible variety of designs. It shows, like the bark cloth of the Aturi, it has a sort of basic underlying pattern, but it also has this sort of evolving and metamorphosizing designs, sort of interlocking in this sort of complicated way. Another Kuba fabric, which is quite famous, not as laborious, but still quite bold and beautiful, is the Applique Raffia. And we're here, it's not a sort of deep pile embroidery. It's kind of a much sort of bold patterned, striking geometric interlocking forms. And this is, there are about 200 named patterns in use by women weavers. Applique can be found many different parts of Africa as a way of kind of sort of drawing, painting on fabric, using pieces of colored fabric and sewing them onto a more neutral background, of providing a kind of bold way of displaying images and icons. The Boccaccio album Faun from the Republic of Benin, the Faun have a rather exciting tradition of creating these sort of flag-like emblematic appliques that are used in display for clans and tribal gatherings. These are people who can kind of demonstrate their pride. And really the idea was inspired by British and colonial uses of flags, and they felt they needed to create them, that they were something carried into battle, just like the British might during their own political military maneuvers. The Asofo flag of Afante Men's Company here is imported cotton fabrics. Asofo means war people. These applique patchwork banners combine a tradition of communication by proverb with military pomp and display. Flags would be created for the installation of a new captain of a local militia company and would be displayed at festivals and funerals. Each unique flag would either depict a historic event, identify the company with an animal or image of power, or depict a proverb or a boast to taunt and threaten other companies. The British flag was used until about 1957, since the flag of Ghana is often substituted, as is no longer a colony of the British. Now I want to talk about weaving. Now we've been sort of talking about painting and sewing and stitching and embroidering, different things. Now the very nature, the most basic kind of fabric construction, weaving traditions, which really the oldest evidence we have is in Meroe Kingdom in Nubia, about 500 to 300 AD. We have pieces of fabric that have been found there woven, and they tend to be sort of narrow strip loom fabric. This is Telem example here, who somewhere between the 11th and the 12th century, the Telem lived in West Africa. And so they probably picked up the technology across the North African caravan trade around 200, 400 CE. There may have been early textiles that, of course, decayed since then. But this is the oldest surviving sample we have of early fabrics in the region. This sort of what is now southern Mali, right on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. This is a region that would have picked up the textile making traditions. So as we're talking about textiles, it's very important to have the terminology correct here, and I need to remind myself here. When we talk about warp threads, we're talking about the vertical threads of a weave, and we're talking about weft threads. We're talking about the horizontal threads that are drawn back and forth through the warp. One of the most established of the weaving communities, who clearly have a big influence in the area, are the Fulani, who are part of a nomadic group that have been long traders across the Sahara. They deal with the Tuareg and others up there in Mali along the borders of the Sahara. And they were very significant in their influence in the development of the textile industry in West Africa. We know that the Asantes, who are probably the most celebrated weavers in Africa, they have a name for the Fulani blanket, nsa, is the same word for the warp threads that they use. So there's perhaps at some point similar technologies and development began with the Fulani and further spread into the Asante. Fulani blankets are widely used in the Asante region, and they're even found used in Asante royal regalia. So the Asante's skill in weaving is still greatly respected and admired, and still plays a role in the kind of culture of textiles among the Asante. The Asante is a West African kingdom that has, as I said, a very famous tradition of weaving. And there are two most common stories that we have for weaving. Is that in about the 17th century, two brothers, Nana Korago and Nana Amoyo, were hunting when they came across a spider, and having watched a spider long enough to learn its technique. And so here, the story of learning weaving from a spider is kind of a popular fable. And we see images and icons of this on this royal staff. These two people calling attention to the spider. The spider in West Africa plays a very important role. His name is Anansi, as a kind of what's called a trickster character, a character who is sort of teaching people at the same time kind of fooling them and beguiling them into new ways of thinking and new ways of acting. Weaving is really fundamentally different than a spider's web, and so you couldn't really learn weaving from the work of a spider. But the idea of a spider, of course, this idea of a knowledgeable trickster character, does play an important role in African culture. Another more practical legend tells of a man named Ota Karaban who visited Bonduku, what is now the Ivory Coast. That would be further east of where the Asante live today. And he brought back a loom, and he set it up on a Friday. Hence, the name of the loom today is Unsadua Kofi. It is the loom set up on a Friday. Friday is a very important sacred day in this region, which is in many cases Muslim. And so there would be Friday would have been sacred for that reason as well. Unsaduaso is the formal name for royal Kente cloth. These royal Kente cloths are designs that are specifically made for the Asante Hene, who is the king of the Asante kingdom. And the wearing of this royal regalia is an important part of the ceremonial practices established in the Asante kingdom, which has been around since about the 1680s, 1770. Royal Kente, commissioned from the city of Bonwir, is the most famous of all, and that is where all of the major Kente production exists today. To understand the royal regalia of the Asante, we have to understand, first of all, that the most important royal regalia is not Kente cloth, though it is very important. It is not the most important royal regalia. The central shrine of the Asante kingdom is a stool. And there's a very special golden stool, which is the actual seat of royal power. And the king does not sit on that seat. You see, the Asante Hene here is seated next to a chair that is holding the golden stool. It's very important. Sacred golden stool. The golden Sika Duokofi, the golden stool born on a Friday. And this is a seat that is never sat upon, but is in fact a kind of placeholder for all the kings of the past. So as the stools are the most important royal regalia, other royal objects, including Kente cloth, are classified as stool property and thought to be owned by the state as a whole. Let's look at the stools of the Asantes. These are these really interesting saddle-shaped stools. They're carved from a single piece of wood, and they tend to have a flared top part and a flat square base and heavily decorated legs going up and sort of pierced wood designs, sometimes inlaid with metal in decorative patterns. And very importantly, where the two flared parts meet the actual seat of the stool, you'll often see a series of small holes. These holes are important because it's through these holes, it is believed, the voice of the ancestors can be heard. The idea of this stool being a person is often just because the stool is discussed in anthropomorphic terms. The support, the base, something that comes up from the base, is the neck, and the seat is termed the head or face of the stool. A leader's stool is intricately linked to his identity. His death is described by the phrase of the death of a leader is described, the stool has fallen. Before burial, the chief's body is ritually washed on the stool. After the funeral, the seat may be knocked sideways to prevent malevolent spirits from inhabiting it. The stools of the most important chiefs are blackened after their deaths of their owners through the ritual application of smoke and other offerings that are then placed on altars where they facilitate communication with the spirits of the dead. Now let's go back to Kente Cloth and look at the Kente designs. Kente is initially woven on a narrow loom, and then the designs are sort of linked together and stitched in these long threads, creating a very, very large, complicated weave. It's kind of hard to take in a whole Kente cloth because of the extraordinary complexity of the design. The colors of yellow, gold. Now, new modern colors, which are extraordinarily popular. You can see here this very intricate, complex woven design, alternating in many, many different ways. So we'll look at it, kind of break down what goes into a Kente cloth. To begin with, there's this, as I said, a very narrow treadle loom that is used in the making. You see how the person sitting here has got foot controls that allow them to apply tension to certain threads, and they can very quickly draw the certain threads down and press the warp threads through. Predominantly, the weavers are male. It has traditionally been passed down from father to son, but only recently have women begun to weave. There has been long-standing tradition of saying that women should not weave because it would make them sterile, unable to bear children. And this one young woman here has defied that idea. Not only weaves, but she is also very proud to show off her many young children. Kente has a lot of different uses among the royal court. Its most celebrated use is during the Kese Durbar. The Durbar means sort of turning out and it's kind of showing up and pledging your allegiance to the king. And during this, all the local chiefs come dressed in their finery, and they bring gifts, and they swear their oath of allegiance to the Asante. You can see how the royal chief here is surrounded by his retainers. These retainers wear a wax-resist dye of indigo, and he is wearing this kind of brilliant orange, gold, and black design. And so the sort of cool colors of the indigo kind of accent the very striking designs of the Kente cloth. Kente cloth is also an important symbol used when there are royal tents or palanquins where the royalty ride to these events, or when they have deceased and then their lives are celebrated. There's a special tent that's built outside the home of the deceased where the body is laid to rest while the funeral preparations are being made. Another very interesting use of Kente cloth is the worship of the Tano River deities. In this case, they set up these shrines, which are usually these large ceramic or brass vessels filled with magical elements. And then these vessels are sort of wrapped in Kente cloth. It's a way of kind of showing that these spirits of the river Tano are part of a kind of royal regalia themselves. You'll notice that this spirit deity is resting on a royal stool, and that there are many ivory and other objects here that would have enhanced the special power and privileges of this Tano River spirit. Many of the designs used in Kente cloth have very specific meanings, and these motifs that are used that people would deliberately call on. So when they are in public and when they are showing themselves to the Asante Hene, their values, and demonstrate their knowledge of traditional lore through the wearing of these special designs, which they choose. An example of these kinds of verbal wit and riddles is the rainbow motif, or God's Arch, on the royal counselor staff. The motif means the Asante Hene is the rainbow that surrounds all of his subjects. Or in another context, someone might wear such a design as the rainbow motif to suggest the rainbow of death encircles every man's neck. So these kinds of messages and morals are part of the way a person sort of demonstrates their cultural knowledge, and that these ideas are sort of embodied in these royal activities. Now, the meaning of a pattern is usually a combination of two different design elements. There is a sort of tighter design element called the babadua, and a kind of looser design element called the aduan, a simpler design element. It's these two babadua and one aduan that make up this susuda, which is the meaning. So these different parts have importance. Now there are single weave and double weave kente. I've mostly been showing you double weave kente, but single weave, of course, is much less expensive, much less complexly woven. Double weave really has a kind of thickness to it and an incredible density in the design that it's used for the decoration. So first, let's look at the aduan, the central part of the design, which is usually kind of less ornate, sometimes just simple vertical lines. And there are a whole variety of these, and each one of them in combination with the babadua creates an interesting sort of counterpoint or meaning. So, like for example, A here, if you climb a good tree, you get a push. And so this idea of community and support and helping others, this would be a part of the message you wanted to communicate. So there are lots of different sort of morals and ideas that can be kind of embodied in these kente designs. Here's another part of the babadua, and these, again, more tightly woven decorative elements. Number B, the cannon, is actually the sort of stepped platform that is used on the base of a cannon to hold a cannon in place. That's sort of the idea there. There's different examples of ways in which these patterns and designs have been applied and used by different people. Kente has really grown in popularity across all parts of Africa and outside as well, so that because of the sort of visibility of this design, we find it as being a kind of stand-in for all African textiles and African designs. We see kente as a kind of stand-in for what we could clearly see as a kind of classic example of African textiles and the sort of richness of African textiles. Even though it is very specific to the Asante in Africa, it's seen as very exclusively a kind of Asante Ghani kind of tradition. Here we have Kente Cloth, Ghani and Barbie, and of course Mickey and Minnie here celebrating Africa by wearing kente.